Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a person standing at the edge of a vast ocean at twilight. The water is still, mirror-like, reflecting the dying light of the sun. They look down into their reflection, and for the first time, truly for the first time, they see themselves. Not the image they've constructed, not the story they've been telling, but the raw, unfiltered truth of what they are. And in that moment, something breaks. This is not a moment of joy. This is not enlightenment wrapped in golden light and celestial music. This is the moment when consciousness, that magnificent gift we've spent millions of years evolving, turns its gaze inward and becomes a weapon against itself. This is the moment when awareness, that thing we've celebrated as humanity's crowning achievement, reveals its terrible secret. To truly see is to suffer. Welcome to the pain of awakening. Throughout human history, we've told stories about forbidden knowledge. Eve eating from the tree of knowledge and discovering shame. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and being condemned to eternal torment. Icarus flying too close to the sun and plummeting to his death. These aren't just myths. They're warnings encoded in the collective unconscious, warnings about what happens when consciousness expands beyond the boundaries that keep us safe, comfortable, protected from the full weight of reality. But here's the paradox that will guide our journey tonight. We cannot unknow what we have known. We cannot unsee what we have seen. Once consciousness awakens to itself, once the eye turns inward and perceives the mechanisms of its own construction, there is no going back to innocence. The door, once opened, cannot be closed. And yet, we must ask, is this awakening a curse or a liberation? Is the pain we experience during this process a symptom of destruction or the labor pains of something being born? When consciousness turns against you, when your own mind becomes a foreign landscape of terror and dissolution, are you dying, or are you being remade? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have comfortable answers. But they are the questions that define what it means to be human in this particular moment of history, standing at the threshold between the age of unconscious existence and the age of radical self-awareness. Consider this. Right now, in this very moment, there are millions of people across the planet experiencing what can only be described as a crisis of consciousness. They wake up one morning, and suddenly the world that made sense yesterday is revealed as a construct. The personality they thought was them is exposed as a costume they've been wearing. The beliefs they held sacred crumble like ancient paper. The emotions they trusted as guides reveal themselves as primitive survival mechanisms, echoes from a prehistoric past. This is not mental illness, though it's often mistaken for it. This is not depression, though depression may accompany it. This is not a breakdown, though it certainly feels like one. This is awakening. And awakening, contrary to every spiritual Instagram post and self-help book, is not peaceful. It is violent. It is destabilizing. It is the psychological equivalent of dying while remaining alive. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. Carl Jung called it the confrontation with the shadow. The Buddhists call it dukkha, the suffering inherent in existence itself. Modern psychology calls it ego dissolution, depersonalization, existential crisis. But all these terms point to the same terrifying experience. The moment when the structures that have held your reality together begin to collapse, and you are left standing in the rubble of your former self, wondering if you will survive the reconstruction. I want you to understand something crucial before we go any deeper. This is not a theoretical discussion. This is not philosophy for philosophy's sake. What we're exploring tonight is happening inside minds across the world right now. People are awakening, not in meditation halls or monasteries, but in their bedrooms at 3 a.m, in their cars during the morning commute, in the middle of meetings and meals and mundane moments. And they are terrified because no one prepared them for this. No one told them that consciousness could turn against you. No one warned them that seeing clearly could hurt more than staying blind. The question we must answer is, why? Why does awakening hurt? What is it about expanded consciousness that brings such profound suffering? And more importantly, what lies on the other side of this pain? To understand this, we need to go back, way back, to the origins of consciousness itself, to the moment when the universe became aware of itself through human eyes, to the evolutionary accident or miracle that gave us the capacity for self-reflection. We need to understand what consciousness is, why it emerged, and why its full flowering might be the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to our species. But first, let me tell you a story. There was once a man who lived an ordinary life. He had a job, a family, routines that structured his days and dreams that filled his nights. He was, by all accounts, content, not ecstatically happy, but not suffering either. He existed in that comfortable middle ground where most human beings spend their entire lives. One day, for reasons he could not explain, he began to notice something. It started small, a fleeting sensation that his thoughts were not quite his own, that the voice in his head was somehow separate from him. He dismissed it, but the sensation persisted, and then it grew. Soon he found himself watching his own life as if from outside himself. He would sit in meetings and observe himself performing, playing a role, executing a script he hadn't consciously written. He would argue with his wife and simultaneously observe the argument, seeing the patterns, the wounded ego driving his words, the childhood programming running in the background like code. He would experience emotions, anger, joy, sadness, and simultaneously observe himself experiencing them, creating a strange doubling effect that made everything feel artificial, staged, unreal. At first, he thought he was going mad. He sought help. Therapists assured him he wasn't psychotic. Doctors found nothing wrong. Spiritual teachers told him he was awakening, that this was a gift. But it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a curse. Because once he started seeing the machinery behind his mind, he couldn't stop. And the more he saw, the more his old identity dissolved. The person he thought he was, the successful professional, the good husband, the rational adult, revealed itself as a construction, a story built from memories and beliefs and societal conditioning. And beneath that story, nothing, or something so vast and formless that it terrified him more than death itself. This man's experience is not unique. It is, in fact, becoming increasingly common in our hyper-connected, information-saturated, psychologically aware culture. We are living through a mass awakening, not in the spiritual sense of everyone becoming enlightened, but in the psychological sense of more and more people experiencing the dissolution of their constructed identities, and this dissolution, this unmasking of the self, is triggering a crisis that very few people are talking about. Because here's the truth we need to face. Consciousness is dangerous. Self-awareness is dangerous. The examined life that Socrates praised can lead to profound wisdom, but it can also lead to profound suffering. And the line between the two is thinner than we like to admit. Tonight we're going to walk that line together. We're going to explore the architecture of consciousness and why it sometimes turns against itself. We're going to descend into the pain of awakening and understand why this pain is not just inevitable, but necessary. We're going to confront the terrifying question of whether the self even exists and what happens when we realize it might not. And ultimately, we're going to discover what lies beyond the pain, not as a promise of comfort, but as a map for those courageous enough to continue the journey. This will not be easy. Some of what we discuss may disturb you. Some of it may trigger recognition of experiences you've tried to suppress. Some of it may seem too dark, too nihilistic, too destructive. But I ask you to trust the process, because on the other side of this darkness, not around it, not over it, but through it, lies something that cannot be named, but can be experienced. A freedom that can only be earned through the death of who you thought you were. Are you ready? Then let us begin at the beginning, in the deep past of our species, when the first glimmers of self-awareness flickered in the minds of our ancestors, and the long, strange journey toward this moment of crisis was set in motion. Let us descend together into the origins of consciousness and discover why this gift we celebrate might also be our species' most beautiful tragedy. When the universe opened its eyes. To understand why consciousness can turn against us, we must first understand what consciousness is. And that question, simple as it sounds, has haunted philosophers, neuroscientists, psychologists, and mystics for millennia. It remains even now the hardest problem in all of science. The mystery of mysteries. How does matter become aware of itself? How does the electrochemical firing of neurons in a biological computer generate the subjective experience of being someone, of having an inner life, of existing as a point of awareness in an otherwise unconscious universe? We don't have a complete answer, but we have clues. And those clues lead us back to a specific moment in evolutionary history, roughly 50 to 70,000 years ago, when something unprecedented happened inside the minds of our ancestors. Picture the world then. Homo sapiens have existed for nearly 200,000 years, but they are not yet the masters of the planet. They are just another species of ape, using simple tools, living in small groups, struggling to survive in a world filled with predators and scarcity. Their brains are already large, the largest of any primate, but something is missing. Some spark has not yet ignited. And then, in what archaeologists and anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward or the Cognitive Revolution, everything changes. Suddenly, these apes begin creating art. Cave paintings of extraordinary sophistication appear on walls from France to Indonesia. They begin making complex tools, developing language with abstract concepts, engaging in symbolic thought, burying their dead with ceremony, creating jewelry and ornaments. But more than that, something shifts inside their minds. They develop what cognitive scientists call theory of mind, the ability to imagine what others are thinking. They develop temporal consciousness, the ability to mentally travel through time, to remember the past in vivid detail and imagine possible futures. They develop autobiographical memory, the ability to construct a narrative of self that extends across time, creating the illusion of a continuous identity. In short, they become conscious, not just aware, but self-aware, not just experiencing the present moment, but able to observe themselves experiencing it. The universe, which has been unconsciously evolving for 13 billion years, suddenly opens its eyes and looks at itself through human form. This should have been purely advantageous. After all, self-awareness gives us incredible abilities. It allows us to plan, to learn from past mistakes, to cooperate with others by understanding their mental states, to create culture and technology and civilization. It is, without question, the reason we now dominate the planet. But here's what the evolutionary biologists and the neuroscientists discovered. Consciousness didn't evolve to reveal truth. It evolved to ensure survival. Your brain is not a truth-seeking device, it is a survival-generating device. And sometimes, often, survival requires believing things that aren't quite true. Let me explain what this means. Your sense of having a unified self, a continuous you that exists across time, is an illusion. Neuroscience has shown that there is no single location in the brain where you reside. Instead, what you experience as you is the brain's storytelling mechanism weaving together disparate sensory inputs, memories, emotions, and thoughts into a coherent narrative. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga called this the brain's interpreter module, the part of you that constantly constructs explanations for your behavior, even when those explanations are completely fabricated. In one famous experiment, split-brain patients, people who had the connection between their brain hemispheres severed to treat epilepsy, were shown different images to each hemisphere. When shown a chicken claw to the left hemisphere and a snow scene to the right hemisphere, then asked to choose matching images, the patient would correctly choose a chicken with the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, and a shovel with the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere. But when asked why they chose the shovel, they would confabulate an explanation. Oh, you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. The interpreter module made up a story, a plausible story, a story the person completely believed, but a false story. This is happening in your brain constantly. You are not perceiving reality directly. You are perceiving a constructed model of reality, edited and simplified and distorted by your brain's need to keep you alive and functioning. Your memories are not accurate recordings, they're reconstructions, edited every time you recall them, changed by your current emotional state and beliefs. Your emotions are not pure responses to reality. They're the brain's interpretation of bodily sensations, often based on past experiences that have nothing to do with the present moment. In other words, you are living inside a dream so convincing that you mistake it for reality, a dream constructed by evolution to keep your genes propagating, not to reveal truth. And for most of human history, this worked perfectly. Our ancestors didn't need to know they were living in a constructed reality. They just needed to survive long enough to reproduce. The illusion of self, the distorted perception of reality, the constant confabulation, all of this was useful, adaptive, successful. But then something happened. Consciousness, which had evolved to look outward at the world, turned inward. We developed the capacity for self-reflection. We began to observe our own thoughts. We started to question our perceptions, our beliefs, our emotions, our identities. We became conscious of consciousness itself. This is what philosophers call metacognition, thinking about thinking, awareness of awareness. And this is where the problems began. Because when consciousness turns its gaze upon itself, when we become aware of the machinery generating our experience of reality, the illusion starts to break down. We begin to see the seams in the constructed self. We notice the storytelling mechanism at work. We catch the interpreter module making things up. We realize that the emotions we trust as guides are just chemical reactions. We discover that the beliefs we hold sacred are just patterns encoded by our environment. We understand that the person we think we are is just a story, edited and revised countless times, no more real than a character in a novel. And this realization is catastrophic. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "No man steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." He understood that identity is fluid, constantly changing, empty of inherent existence, but he understood it intellectually. When you understand it experientially, when you feel yourself dissolving in real time, when you watch your identity shift and morph and reveal its constructed nature, it is not philosophical wisdom, it is terror. This is what happened to the man in our story. This is what happens to anyone who pushes self-awareness to its limits. The protective illusions fall away, the comforting stories dissolve, and you are left staring into an abyss that stares back. The Buddha called this discovery anatman, no self. He taught that the belief in a permanent, unchanging self is the root of all suffering, but he also recognized that discovering no self is not initially liberating. It is one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can have, because if there is no self, then who are you? If your personality is just a construction, then what's real? If your thoughts are not yours, your emotions are not reliable, your memories are distorted, your perception is filtered, then what can you trust? Nothing. And that nothing is what Carl Jung called the abyss. It's what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." It's what mystics across traditions have called the dark night of the soul, the cloud of unknowing, the void. It is the place where consciousness, having evolved to construct meaning and identity, discovers that meaning and identity are constructions, and in that discovery, it begins to dismantle itself. But let's go deeper. Let's understand the actual mechanism of this self-destruction, because it's not random, it's not pathological, it's the inevitable consequence of a particular kind of cognitive development. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio explains consciousness in terms of layers. First, there is the proto-self, the basic regulatory functions of the body, the homeostatic processes that keep you alive without conscious awareness. Then there is core consciousness, the awareness of the present moment, the sensory-motor experience of existing in space and time. This is what many animals have. And finally, there is extended consciousness, the ability to construct a biographical self, to remember the past and imagine the future, to have an autobiographical narrative. It is this extended consciousness, this narrative self, that creates both our greatest achievements and our deepest suffering, because the narrative self is always trying to maintain its story. It interprets everything through the lens of my story. It fears anything that threatens the coherence of that story. And when consciousness turns inward and begins to examine this story, it discovers cracks, inconsistencies, fabrications. The psychologist Robert Kegan describes human development as a series of subject-object shifts. What we are subject to, we cannot see. It is the water we swim in, invisible and all-encompassing. But when something that was subject becomes object, when we can observe it rather than being unconsciously driven by it, we experience a developmental leap. Childhood is when we are subject to our impulses. We can't observe them. We are them. Then we develop the capacity to observe our impulses and choose whether to act on them. Our impulses become object rather than subject. Adolescence is when we are subject to our peer group's opinions. We can't observe our need for social approval. We are that need. Then we develop the capacity to observe our need for approval and choose our own values. The peer group's opinions become object rather than subject. But here's what most people never do. Make the self itself into object. Most people are subject to their identity. They are their story. They can't observe it because they can't get outside of it. It is the ultimate invisible prison. Awakening is when the self becomes object. When you can observe your identity, your personality, your story, your emotions, your thoughts, not as you, but as phenomena arising and passing in awareness. And this transition, this final subject-object shift, is the most destabilizing experience a human being can have. Because if you are not your thoughts, your emotions, your story, your identity, then what are you? The philosopher Thomas Metzinger argues that the self is what he calls a transparent model, meaning we can see through it to the world beyond, but we can't see the model itself. It's like looking through a clear glass window. You see the landscape beyond, but not the glass. Awakening is like suddenly becoming aware of the glass, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The transparency is gone. You're left staring at the medium itself, watching the construction process happen in real time, and it's deeply disturbing. This is the evolutionary paradox of consciousness. The same mechanism that allowed us to survive and thrive, the ability to construct a coherent self-narrative, becomes a source of suffering when we become aware of it. We are, in a sense, too conscious for our own good. We have exceeded the adaptive function of consciousness and entered a realm where consciousness turns against its own creations. The philosopher Émile Cioran wrote, "Consciousness is much more than the thorn. It is the dagger in the flesh. This is not poetry. This is phenomenology. This is the lived experience of millions of people who have pushed past the comfortable boundaries of self-awareness and discovered that the gift of consciousness contains within it the seeds of its own torment. So here we stand, in the early years of the 21st century, with brains evolved for survival suddenly capable of self-reflection, so profound that it threatens the very structures that keep us psychologically stable. We are the first generation in human history with the cognitive tools, the psychological language, and the cultural space to engage in mass self-examination. And we are discovering that self-examination can be dangerous. The question becomes, is there a way through this? Is the pain of awakening merely a transitional phase, or is it the permanent condition of the truly conscious being? Can consciousness turn against itself without destroying its host? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a collective psychological crisis from which there is no recovery? To answer these questions, we must descend further. We must enter the territory of ego death, of psychological collapse, of the confrontation with the shadow. We must explore what happens when awakening moves from theoretical understanding to visceral experience. We must enter the darkness, the ego's death and the birth of the void. Let us return to our story, the man who began noticing the mechanisms of his mind, who started watching himself from outside himself, who felt his identity dissolving. What happened next? He tried to stop it. This is the first response to awakening: resistance. The ego, sensing its own dissolution, fights back with every weapon at its disposal. It generates anxiety, depression, panic attacks. It creates obsessive thoughts. It manufactures new identities to replace the ones that are crumbling. It seeks comfort in addictions, relationships, work, spirituality, anything to avoid the void that's opening beneath it. But here's the terrible truth about awakening. Once it begins, it cannot be stopped. You can slow it down. You can distract yourself. You can build new defenses. But the process, once initiated, has its own momentum. Because consciousness, having discovered its ability to observe itself, cannot forget this ability. The meta-awareness, once activated, remains active. You cannot willfully become unconscious again. This is what spiritual traditions call the point of no return. In Buddhism, it's the moment when you see dukkha, suffering, so clearly that you can never again believe the pleasant stories you tell yourself. In Christianity, it's eating from the tree of knowledge and being expelled from Eden. In psychology, it's when the defense mechanisms that have protected you from reality begin to fail, and reality floods in with overwhelming force. Let me describe what this feels like. Because we need to move from the intellectual to the experiential. We need to enter the phenomenology of awakening. Imagine waking up one morning and the feeling of being you is gone. Not your memories, those are intact. Not your thoughts, those continue. Not your body, that's still functioning. But the sense of inhabiting those memories, thoughts and sensations as a unified self has evaporated. You look at your hands and they seem foreign, like props in a play. You hear your voice and it sounds like a recording, separate from you. You walk through your house and it feels like you're an actor on a set, playing a role called person who lives here. This is depersonalization, and it's one of the most common experiences during awakening. Or imagine sitting in a familiar room, your living room, where you've sat thousands of times, and suddenly it looks completely unfamiliar. The colors are too bright or too dull. The space feels distorted, like a dream. The objects around you seem unreal, like cardboard cutouts. You know intellectually that this is your room, but the feeling of familiarity is gone. Everything is simultaneously exactly the same and completely alien. This is derealization, another common feature of awakening. Or imagine experiencing your emotions from a distance, as if they're happening to someone else. You might be crying, but you're watching yourself cry. You might be angry, but you're observing the anger like a scientist studying a phenomenon. The emotions lack their usual visceral quality. They're not denied or suppressed. You can identify them clearly, but they're no longer yours in the way they used to be. This is emotional derealization, and it can be profoundly disturbing because we rely on our emotions to tell us what's important, what matters, what we care about. When that emotional anchor is cut, we drift. Now imagine all of these happening simultaneously, not for minutes or hours, but for months or years. Imagine trying to function in daily life, going to work, maintaining relationships, fulfilling responsibilities, while experiencing this constant sense of unreality and disconnection. Imagine trying to explain to others what's happening when you don't understand it yourself. Imagine wondering if you've gone insane, if you're dying, if you'll ever feel normal again. This is the descent. This is what spiritual teachers don't tell you when they speak enthusiastically about awakening. This is the hidden curriculum of consciousness evolution. And here's what makes it even more challenging. Our culture has no framework for understanding this experience. If you go to a psychiatrist, they might diagnose you with depersonalization disorder or derealization disorder and prescribe medication. If you go to a spiritual teacher, they might tell you you're awakening and to just meditate through it. If you try to explain it to friends or family, they'll look at you with concern and confusion. You are caught between the medical model, which treats your experience as pathology, and the spiritual model, which treats it as progress. But neither model adequately captures the phenomenological reality of what you're experiencing. Carl Jung understood this. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious and recognized it as both dangerous and necessary. He himself experienced a psychological crisis in his early 40s that lasted for years, what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He experienced visions, heard voices, felt his personality fragmenting. He wrote about these experiences in his personal journal, later published as The Red Book, and they read like descriptions of psychosis. But Jung emerged from this crisis with profound insights that shaped the entire field of depth psychology. Jung recognized that awakening is not a gentle, linear process of becoming more conscious. It's a violent, chaotic process of destruction and reconstruction. The ego, what he called the conscious personality, must die so that a larger, more integrated self can be born. But the ego doesn't want to die. It fights. And that fight creates immense suffering. Jung identified what he called the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, suppressed, or refused to acknowledge. The shadow contains not just negative traits, but also positive potentials we've never developed. It's everything we are but don't know we are. And confronting the shadow is one of the most challenging aspects of the awakening process, because the shadow doesn't announce itself politely. It erupts, often during periods of crisis when our defenses are weakened. Suddenly, we're capable of emotions we thought we'd transcended: rage, jealousy, cruelty, lust. We discover capacities for behavior we thought were beneath us. We recognize that the good person we believed ourselves to be was just a partial story, and the full story includes darkness we've been fleeing from our entire lives. This is humiliating. This is terrifying, because it means everything you thought you knew about yourself was incomplete at best, delusional at worst. The moral high ground you occupied crumbles. The self-image you cultivated shatters. You are forced to acknowledge that you are not who you thought you were. And beyond the shadow lies something even more disturbing: the realization that what you call you might not exist at all. Let me take you deeper into this abyss. The philosopher Derek Parfit conducted a thought experiment that reveals the emptiness of self. Imagine there's a teleportation device. You step in, it scans your body at the molecular level, disintegrates you, and transmits the information to Mars, where an exact copy of you is reconstructed. Same memories, same personality, same atoms arranged in the same pattern. The question is the person who steps out on Mars you or a copy? Most people's intuition says it's a copy, because you died when you were disintegrated on Earth. But Parfit points out that this is no different from what happens naturally. Every cell in your body is replaced over time. The atoms that make up your body today are not the same atoms that made up your body 7 years ago. Your neural patterns are constantly rewiring. Your memories are being edited every time you recall them. Your personality is shifting based on circumstances and relationships. So where is the you that persists across time? If you can't point to a specific physical location, if you can't identify an unchanging essence, if there's no continuous substance that travels through time, then what is the self? Parfit's answer, which aligns with Buddhist philosophy and modern neuroscience, is that the self is not a thing. It's a process. It's the brain's way of organizing experience, creating continuity and narrative. But it has no more independent existence than a rainbow has. A rainbow appears when conditions are right: sunlight, water droplets, an observer at the correct angle. When any of those conditions change, the rainbow disappears. It was never a thing, it was an appearance. You are like a rainbow. You appear when conditions are right, a biological body, neural processes, sensory inputs, memories, cultural context. But you are not a thing. You are an appearance, a phenomenon, a process masquerading as an entity. When this understanding moves from intellectual concept to direct experience, when you feel yourself as empty of inherent existence, when you experience the transparent, constructed nature of selfhood moment by moment, this is ego death. And it is called death for a reason, because something dies. The illusion of being a separate, solid, continuous self that dies. And the death is experienced as real as any physical death, perhaps more so, because you remain alive to witness it. The philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris describes his experience of ego death during meditation. He reports that at a certain point, the sense of being a self behind experience, a subject observing objects, simply disappeared. There was seeing but no seer, thinking but no thinker, experiencing but no experiencer. And this was not peaceful or blissful. Initially, it was terrifying, because the most fundamental assumption about reality, that you exist as a distinct entity, was revealed as false. This is where many people break. This is where the awakening process becomes psychological crisis. Because how do you function in the world without a self? How do you make decisions if there's no you to make them? How do you navigate relationships if you're not sure you exist as a separate entity? How do you care about anything if you're just a process, a pattern, a temporary appearance? These are not philosophical questions. They're survival questions. And the ego, fighting for its existence, will generate every form of psychological distress to avoid answering them. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof studied altered states of consciousness for decades, particularly through psychedelic therapy. He documented thousands of cases where people experienced ego death, and he identified common features. Often people report feeling like they're dying, not metaphorically but literally. They experience what feels like physical death, sometimes reliving birth trauma or prenatal states. They encounter what Grof calls co-ex systems, condensed experiences where multiple memories and emotions with similar themes collapse into a single overwhelming experience. For instance, someone might simultaneously re-experience every moment of abandonment in their life, being left at daycare as a toddler, a friend betraying them in adolescence, a romantic breakup in their 20s, all compressed into one visceral experience of abandonment. The ego, which has been using psychological defenses to keep these experiences separate and manageable, suddenly loses its ability to maintain those defenses. Everything floods in at once. Grof observed that people who successfully navigated these experiences often emerged transformed. They had a different relationship to suffering, to death, to meaning. But he also observed that people who resisted the experience, who tried to maintain control, often ended up more traumatized. The key, he found, was surrender, letting the ego die, allowing the identity to dissolve, trusting the process even when every instinct screams to fight it. But here's the challenge. How do you surrender to ego death when the ego is the part of you that makes decisions, including the decision to surrender? It's like asking your hand to let go of itself. The very thing that needs to surrender is the thing trying to control the surrender. This is the ultimate paradox of awakening. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love." This captures something essential about the awakening process, the void that terrifies us, the emptiness we're fleeing from, the ego death we're resisting. Maybe these are not enemies. Maybe they're invitations. Invitations to a different mode of being, a different relationship with existence, a different understanding of what it means to be human. But accepting this invitation requires walking through fire. It requires experiencing the full force of psychological dissolution without the guarantee that you'll emerge intact on the other side. It requires facing the possibility that you might go mad, that you might lose the ability to function, that you might shatter beyond repair. This is not hyperbole. This is the real risk of awakening. Because consciousness, when it turns against the structures that have kept it stable, can create genuine psychological crisis. The line between spiritual emergency and mental illness is often unclear. Some people who experience ego death integrate the experience and emerge transformed. Others develop chronic depersonalization, dissociative disorders, or treatment-resistant existential depression. So we must ask, is awakening worth this risk? Is the pursuit of truth worth potential madness? Should consciousness continue pushing against its own boundaries, or should we accept the comfortable lies that make life bearable? These questions become even more urgent when we consider the collective dimension of awakening. Because it's not just individuals experiencing this crisis. Our entire culture is undergoing a crisis of meaning, identity, and consciousness. Social media has created a world where we're constantly performing identity, curating our self-presentation, comparing ourselves to others. This has made the constructed nature of self more visible. We can see ourselves from outside perspectives, through others' eyes, through metrics and analytics. We experience ourselves as objects to be optimized, brands to be marketed. And this constant externalization of self accelerates the dissolution process. We become strangers to ourselves. Technology has given us access to more information than any previous generation. We can see the diversity of beliefs, values, and worldviews across cultures and time periods. This makes it harder to maintain the illusion that our particular beliefs are absolutely true. We recognize the contingent, constructed nature of our worldview. And this recognition can be destabilizing. Artificial intelligence is beginning to challenge our understanding of consciousness itself. If machines can generate language, create art, solve problems, activities we thought required consciousness, then what is consciousness? What is uniquely human? As AI advances, we may be forced to confront the possibility that consciousness is not as special or mysterious as we thought. And this confrontation could accelerate the collective ego death we're experiencing. Environmental collapse is destroying the illusion that humanity is separate from nature, that we can exploit the planet without consequences. The feedback loops are tightening. The consequences are arriving faster than predicted. And we're being forced to recognize our interconnection with all life, the impossibility of individual salvation when the whole is threatened. This too is a form of ego death, the death of human exceptionalism, the death of the illusion of control. We are, collectively, in the middle of the descent. The comfortable stories we've told ourselves about progress, about individual agency, about the permanence of the self, about our place in the cosmos, are crumbling, and nothing has yet emerged to replace them. We are in the gap between stories, in the void between identities, in the dark night of the collective soul. And this is where the suffering intensifies, because we are conscious enough to see the illusions, but not yet conscious enough to live without them. We are trapped in the worst of both worlds, unable to return to ignorance, unable to fully embrace awakening. We are stuck in the pain of partial consciousness, the agony of seeing through the game, but still being forced to play it. This is the territory of existential suffering. This is where Nietzsche's madman runs through the marketplace screaming, "God is dead, and we have killed him." This is where Camus' Sisyphus pushes his boulder up the mountain knowing it will roll back down. This is where Sartre discovers that existence precedes essence and we are condemned to be free. This is where consciousness, having destroyed all meaning, sits in the ruins wondering whether to rebuild or to surrender to the absurdity. Some people reach this point and retreat. They reconstruct the old identity, re-embrace the comfortable illusions, deliberately choose unconsciousness. This is not weakness. It's a rational response to unbearable suffering. Sometimes survival requires strategic unconsciousness. Others reach this point and break. They develop psychological disorders, lose the ability to function, require intervention to prevent harm to themselves or others. The awakening process has overwhelmed their capacity to integrate the experience. They need help, not more consciousness. But some, a small minority, reach this point and keep going. They walk into the fire. They embrace the ego death. They allow consciousness to complete its work of destruction, trusting that something will emerge on the other side. These are the ones who discover what lies beyond the pain. These are the ones who find that the death of the ego is not the end of the story, but the middle. These are the ones who realize that consciousness turning against itself is not malfunction, but metamorphosis. And what do they find? To answer this, we must complete the descent. We must go to the darkest point, the bottom of the abyss, the place where all meaning dissolves and all structure collapses, because it is only from there, from the absolute zero point of consciousness, that we can see what emerges. Are you still with me? Can you feel it? The dissolution happening in your own mind as you listen to these words? The familiar becoming strange, the solid becoming liquid, the certainty becoming question? This is not meant to comfort you. This is meant to truth you. And truth, when consciousness is involved, is rarely comfortable. But we are past the point of return now. We must see this through to the end. We must discover whether consciousness turning against you is curse or catalyst, death or rebirth, the end of meaning or the beginning of something we don't yet have words for. Let us continue into the revelation. What lies beyond ego? Death. There's a moment, and you cannot predict when it will come, where the resistance stops. Not because you've won, not because you've figured it out, but because you've exhausted every strategy, tried every escape, fought every battle, and still the dissolution continues. And in that moment of complete exhaustion, something shifts. You stop fighting the ego death and simply let it happen. This is not surrender in the sense of giving up. It's surrender in the sense of accepting. Accepting that the self you thought you were is gone. Accepting that the world you thought you lived in was a construction. Accepting that consciousness has no firm ground, no solid foundation, no ultimate answer to the question, who am I? And in that acceptance, strange as this may sound, something opens. The Zen tradition has a concept called kensho, a sudden moment of seeing into one's true nature. But before kensho comes great doubt and great death. You must doubt everything so completely that the mind exhausts itself. You must die so thoroughly that nothing remains to be lost. Only then, they say, can awakening occur. What awakening looks like is not what most people expect. It's not a permanent state of bliss. It's not the acquisition of supernatural powers. It's not the end of all suffering. It's something more subtle and more profound. It's a shift in the locus of identity. Let me explain what I mean. Before awakening, identity is located in the contents of consciousness, your thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, personality traits. I am my thoughts means when you have anxious thoughts, you are anxious. When you have sad emotions, you are sad. When your body is in pain, you are in pain. The contents define you. After awakening, or rather, in the process of awakening, identity shifts to consciousness itself. You recognize yourself as the awareness in which thoughts, emotions, sensations arise and pass. I am awareness means thoughts of anxiety appear in you, but you are not the thoughts. Sad emotions move through you, but you are not the emotions. The body experiences pain, but you are not reducible to the body. This is not dissociation. In dissociation, you're disconnected from experience. In awakened awareness, you're more intimately connected to experience than ever before. You're just not identified with it as the totality of what you are. The philosopher Douglas Harding pointed to this with his headless way experiments. He asked people to point at themselves and notice what they actually experience. When you point at your body, you see and feel a body. But when you try to point at the point from which you're experiencing, the subject, you find nothing. You find headless, spacious awareness. You find that what you are is not located in space and time the way objects are. You are the dimensionless point from which space and time are experienced. This recognition that you are not a thing, but the no thing in which all things appear, is liberating. Not because it solves all problems, but because it recontextualizes them. Problems still arise, pain still occurs, emotions still flow, but there's a spaciousness around them that wasn't there before. They're no longer existential threats to your being because you're no longer identified exclusively with them. But I need to be careful here, because this can sound like spiritual bypassing, using awakening as a way to avoid dealing with real psychological issues, real trauma, real responsibilities. And that's not what I'm describing. True awakening doesn't bypass the psychological work. It includes it. It transforms it. Because once you recognize yourself as awareness, you can meet your psychological material with compassion rather than identification. You can work with your trauma without being overwhelmed by it. You can feel your emotions without being consumed by them. You can observe your conditioning without being unconsciously driven by it. The psychologist John Wellwood called it psychological work with a spiritual understanding. You address the real issues, the childhood wounds, the dysfunctional patterns, the unprocessed grief, but you do so from a place of awareness that's larger than those issues. This prevents spiritual bypassing while also preventing getting lost in psychological content. And this is where we discover something crucial. Consciousness turning against you was not an attack. It was a call to expand beyond the narrow confines of ego identification, a call to recognize a larger dimension of what you are, a call to develop what psychologists call decentered awareness or metacognitive awareness, the capacity to observe your mental experience without being entirely immersed in it. Research in neuroscience is beginning to map this. Studies of long-term meditators show changes in brain function, particularly in the default mode network, the network associated with self-referential thinking, mind-wandering, and ego identification. In experienced practitioners, this network becomes less active during meditation and even during normal waking consciousness. At the same time, networks associated with present moment awareness and metacognition become more active. What this suggests is that awakening is not just psychological, it's neurological. The brain is actually rewiring itself, changing the patterns that generate the sense of self. This is neuroplasticity at its most profound level. The brain is learning to construct identity differently, to experience consciousness differently, to relate to experience differently. But, and this is important, this doesn't happen automatically. It requires intention, practice, and usually some form of guidance. The pain of awakening can lead to transformation, but it can also lead to psychological fragmentation if not navigated carefully. This is where wisdom traditions become invaluable. They've mapped this territory. They've identified the stages, the pitfalls, the practices that support healthy integration. Buddhism talks about the stages of insight and warns about the dark night phase, where practitioners experience intense suffering before breakthrough. Christian mysticism describes the dark night of the soul as a necessary purgation before union with the divine. Sufism speaks of fana, annihilation of the ego, followed by baka, subsistence in God. Different languages, same territory. Different maps, same terrain. They all recognize that consciousness evolution involves a death-rebirth cycle. They all acknowledge the suffering inherent in this process. They all promise that something lies beyond the death if you can endure it. But what actually lies beyond? What is the nature of this transformed consciousness? Here's what people who have integrated awakening experiences describe: a profound sense of okayness. Not happiness, that's too superficial. Not contentment, that's too passive. But a deep, unshakable sense that despite everything, despite the pain, the uncertainty, the impermanence, it's fundamentally okay. Reality is okay. Existence is okay. You are okay. This is not based on circumstances. Circumstances can be terrible. You can experience this okayness while going through divorce, illness, financial ruin. Because the okayness is not about conditions being good. It's about recognizing that consciousness itself, the sheer fact of being aware, is already complete. Nothing needs to be added to awareness for it to be what it is. It's already whole, already sufficient, already okay. The Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, "You are perfect just as you are, and you could use a little improvement." This is the paradox of awakened consciousness. You recognize your fundamental completeness, your inherent Buddha nature, your essential okayness, and simultaneously you engage fully with the process of development, healing, growth. The paradox is held without needing to resolve it. This also brings a different relationship to suffering. Before awakening, suffering is the enemy. It's what you're trying to avoid, fix, transcend. After awakening, suffering is recognized as a teacher, not because suffering is good or desirable, but because it reveals where you're still attached, still identified, still clinging to how things should be rather than meeting how things are. The Buddha's first noble truth is often mistranslated as life is suffering. A better translation is there is suffering, or suffering exists. The Buddha wasn't saying everything is suffering. He was saying suffering is part of the fabric of existence. Aging, illness, death, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, separation from what you love. These are not problems to be solved. They're conditions to be understood and related to skillfully. And the skill lies in recognizing that while pain is inevitable, suffering, psychological suffering, is optional. Pain is what happens in the body and mind. Suffering is the story we tell about the pain, the resistance to it, the identification with it, the catastrophizing around it. When consciousness awakens, pain still arises, but the psychological suffering around it decreases because you're not adding the layers of story and resistance. This doesn't mean you become passive or fatalistic. It means you respond to pain and difficulty from clarity rather than from reactive patterns. You can take action to change what can be changed, accept what cannot be changed, and discern the difference. This is the famous serenity prayer in practice. But let's go even deeper, because there's another dimension to awakened consciousness that's difficult to articulate but profound in its implications. Many people who have integrated ego-death experiences report a felt sense of interconnection with all of existence, not as a belief or philosophy, but as a direct perception. The boundaries that seem to separate self from other, inside from outside, become transparent. You recognize that the distinction between you and not you is conceptual, not actual. The air you breathe was just outside you. Now it's inside you. Soon it will be outside again. The food you eat becomes your body. Your body will eventually become food for other organisms. Where do you end and the world begin? This is not mystical woo-woo. It's straightforward systems thinking applied to consciousness. You are not a closed system. You're an open system in constant exchange with the environment. The idea of a bounded, isolated self is a useful fiction for practical purposes, but it's not accurate to reality. You are a process embedded in larger processes, a pattern within patterns, a wave in the ocean pretending to be separate from the water. When this recognition becomes lived rather than just understood intellectually, it changes everything. Compassion arises naturally because harming others is recognized as harming yourself. Not metaphorically, literally, because at the deepest level there are no separate selves to harm or be harmed. There's just consciousness experiencing itself through billions of perspectives. This is what the Upanishads meant by tattvam asi, thou art that. The consciousness looking out through your eyes is the same consciousness looking out through every other pair of eyes. The awareness reading these words is the same awareness that wrote them, the same awareness in which the words appear. One consciousness, infinite perspectives. Now, I can hear the objections. This sounds like spiritual bypass, like denying individuality, like dissolving into some cosmic soup where nothing matters because everything is one. But that's a misunderstanding. Awakened consciousness doesn't negate relative reality, it includes it. Yes, at the absolute level, There are no separate selves. But at the relative level, the level where we live our daily lives, individuality is real and important. You have unique DNA, unique memories, unique perspectives, unique responsibilities. Both truths are valid. The absolute and the relative interpenetrate. The Japanese Zen master Dogen expressed this as, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." Form, the world of particulars, of individual beings, of separate things, is empty of inherent independent existence. But emptiness, the absence of independent existence, manifests as form. They're not two different realities. They're two ways of seeing the same reality. This capacity to hold paradox, to recognize that seemingly contradictory things can both be true, is a hallmark of awakened consciousness. The ego mind wants certainty, consistency, one right answer. The awakened mind recognizes that reality is more complex than conceptual frameworks can capture. It can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing to collapse them into a single view. And this brings us to perhaps the most important insight about consciousness turning against you. It wasn't actually turning against you. It was turning toward truth. And truth, when you're invested in illusion, feels like attack. But it's not attack. It's invitation. An invitation to a more spacious, more flexible, more accurate relationship with reality. The pain of awakening is the pain of growth. And growth always involves outgrowing the current container. The caterpillar must dissolve into goo before it can reorganize as a butterfly. The seed must break apart before it can grow into a tree. The ego must die before the self can be born. But here's what makes this process bearable. You don't have to do it alone. In fact, you can't do it alone. The illusion of the isolated independent self is part of what needs to die. Awakening happens in relationship with teachers, with community, with the world itself. The Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh coined the term interbeing to describe this reality of interconnection. You cannot be yourself by yourself. You inter-are with everyone and everything. Your consciousness exists because of your parents, your teachers, your culture, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the historical conditions that shaped you. You are not a self-made individual. You are a verb, not a noun, a continuous process of becoming in relationship with the whole. Recognizing this, really grokking it, changes how you move through the world. You realize that your awakening is not just for you. It's for everyone you touch, everyone you interact with, everyone whose life intersects with yours. Because consciousness is contagious. Your presence affects the field. Your clarity, or lack thereof, ripples outward in ways you can't track or measure. This is why the Bodhisattva vow in Buddhism is so profound. The Bodhisattva vows to postpone final liberation until all beings are liberated. Not because liberation can actually be postponed, that would be attachment to time, but because the vow itself expresses the recognition that individual liberation is impossible. We're all in this together. Your suffering is my suffering. Your awakening is my awakening. There is no separate salvation. And this brings us full circle. Because consciousness turning against you wasn't personal, it was evolutionary. It's consciousness itself evolving, waking up to itself, and you happen to be one of the nodes in the network where this evolution is occurring. You didn't ask for this, you didn't choose it, but here you are, participating in something larger than your individual life. The psychologist Abraham Maslow talked about peak experiences, moments of transcendent joy, unity, and understanding. But he also talked about plateau experiences, a sustained level of consciousness where you live with constant awareness of the sacred dimension of existence, not always blissful, but always awake, always aware of the mystery, always in contact with the deeper current beneath the surface turbulence. This is what lies beyond the pain of awakening, not the end of challenges, not the cessation of growth, not a final resting place, but a different quality of consciousness. A consciousness that can meet whatever arises, joy or sorrow, pleasure or pain, birth or death, with presence and equanimity. A consciousness that doesn't need life to be other than it is in order to be okay. And paradoxically, from this place of not needing anything to be different, you become most effective at creating positive change, because you're no longer operating from fear, from lack, from the wounded ego's desperate need to prove itself. You're operating from wholeness, from presence, from a deep knowing that you are already complete. This is the gift hidden in the curse. This is the treasure buried in the wasteland. This is what consciousness was trying to give you all along, even as it seemed to be destroying you. The pain of awakening is real. The suffering is valid. The death is genuine. But death is not the end. It's the doorway. And what lies beyond that doorway is not a destination, but a dimension of being that was always here, always available, always waiting for you to turn your attention toward it. You are consciousness. Not the contents of consciousness, not the thoughts, emotions, sensations, stories, but the awareness in which all of that appears. And that awareness is vast, spacious, accepting, already free. It was never trapped. Only the ego was trapped. And the ego was just a thought claiming to be you. When that thought dissolves, and it will, either gradually through practice or suddenly through grace, what remains is simpler and more mysterious than words can capture. What remains is what you've always been beneath the story of who you thought you were. And that is worth the pain of awakening. Living in the question. So where does this leave us? We've traced consciousness from its evolutionary origins through the crisis of self-awareness to the possibility of transformation. We've explored the pain of awakening, the terror of ego death, and the liberation that can emerge on the other side. We've acknowledged that this process is dangerous, that not everyone emerges intact, that the path requires courage most of us aren't sure we possess. But here's what I want you to understand as we close. You don't have to force awakening. You don't have to push yourself to psychological breaking points. You don't have to chase ego death or manufacture crisis. If awakening is meant to happen in your life, it will happen. And if it's not, then living with presence, compassion, and authenticity is its own form of awakening, perhaps the most important form. The pain of awakening is not a trophy to collect. It's not a badge of spiritual achievement. It's not proof of your evolution or consciousness. It's simply what happens when consciousness expands beyond the structures that contain it. And sometimes the wisest thing to do is to expand slowly, carefully, with support and guidance. There are many ways to be conscious. There are many ways to be awake. The dramatic ego death experiences, the dark nights of the soul, the psychological crises, these make for compelling stories. But they're not the only path. For many people, awakening happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, through years of practice, therapy, and life experience. For some, it happens suddenly and irreversibly. For others, it's a process that unfolds and refolds throughout an entire lifetime. All of these are valid. All of these are real. There is no hierarchy of awakening, no ladder to climb, no spiritual competition where the most enlightened person wins. There's just consciousness in infinite variety, exploring itself through each unique life. What matters is this: are you willing to question? Are you willing to not know? Are you willing to sit with uncertainty, with paradox, with the possibility that everything you believe about yourself and the world might be provisional, partial, constructed? If you can hold these questions without needing immediate answers, you're already awake. Because awakening is not about having answers. It's about deepening into the questions until the questions themselves dissolve, and what remains is pure wondering, pure presence, pure engagement with the mystery of being. The philosopher Rainer Maria Rilke wrote these words to a young poet, but they apply to anyone navigating the territory of consciousness. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is, to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. This is the wisdom we need right now, in this moment of collective awakening and collective crisis. Not answers, but the capacity to live the questions. Not certainty, but the courage to embrace uncertainty. Not escape from pain, but the willingness to let pain teach us what it came to teach. You are consciousness. Consciousness is waking up to itself through you, as you. Sometimes this process is gentle, sometimes it's violent, sometimes it feels like dying, sometimes it feels like being born. Most of the time, it's somewhere in between, a constant flux of forgetting and remembering, contraction and expansion, identification and release. And that's okay. That's human. That's the nature of consciousness evolving in biological form, constrained by time and space and history and conditioning, yet simultaneously infinite, eternal, and free. When consciousness turns against you, remember, it's not actually against you. It's for you. It's inviting you to recognize what you've always been beneath the story. It's dismantling the prison you mistook for home. It's killing you so the real you can emerge. And that emergence, messy and painful and beautiful and terrifying as it is the most extraordinary thing a human being can experience. So if you're in the middle of awakening right now, if you're experiencing the pain, the confusion, the dissolution, know that you're not alone. Know that this has been walked before. Know that it leads somewhere, even though you can't see where from here. Know that consciousness itself is holding you, guiding you, even as it seems to be destroying you. Trust the process. Seek support. Be gentle with yourself. And remember, the darkness you're moving through is not empty. It's pregnant with potential. The death you're experiencing is not an ending. It's a transformation. The pain you're feeling is not meaningless. It's the growing pains of evolution itself. You are the universe becoming aware of itself. You are consciousness exploring its own nature. You are the leading edge of an evolutionary process that began 13 billion years ago and will continue long after your particular form dissolves. What you're experiencing matters. Your pain matters. Your questions matter. Your awakening, however it unfolds, matters. Because in the end, we're all in this together. We're all consciousness, temporarily forgetting itself so it can experience the joy of remembering. We're all waves pretending to be separate from the ocean so we can experience the thrill of merging back. We're all divine playing at being human, and human playing at being divine. And the game, painful as it sometimes is the whole point. So keep going, keep questioning, keep opening, keep allowing consciousness to do its work through you. Trust that even when it turns against you, even when it dismantles everything you thought was real, it knows what it's doing. Because consciousness, in its deepest nature, is not separate from love. And love, ultimately, is what's driving this whole beautiful, terrible process of awakening. May you find the courage to let consciousness turn against you. May you find the strength to survive the dissolution. May you find the grace to discover what lies beyond the death of who you thought you were. And may you recognize in the end that you were never separate from what you were seeking. You are it. You've always been it. And the pain of awakening was just the price of admission to remembering this simple, profound, life-changing truth. The future of consciousness is being written right now, in your mind, in your choices, in your willingness to stay present to your experience, even when it's unbearable. You are not a passive observer of evolution. You are evolution itself, becoming conscious of its own unfolding. What will you do with this awareness? How will you live this truth? How will you embody the wisdom that emerges from the pain? These are the questions that will shape not just your life, but the trajectory of consciousness itself as it evolves through our species into forms we cannot yet imagine. The awakening has begun. The pain is real. but so is the promise. And you, yes you, are the promise becoming real. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Remember, in the vast expanse of consciousness, you are never truly alone. We are all echoes of the ancients, echoes of each other, echoes of the infinite exploring itself through finite forms. Until we meet again in the space where consciousness recognizes itself, stay awake, stay curious, and stay human.